In 2020, Vitaly Vanchurin published a paper titled The World as a Neural Network. The central idea of the paper is that the neural networks used in artificial intelligence may also provide a suitable mathematical framework for describing the physical universe. Today, one of the most popular ideas in theoretical physics is string theory, or more accurately, the various string theories, since there are several of them. According to these theories, space has 9 or even more dimensions, and the most fundamental building block of reality is the superstring. These strings vibrate within this higher dimensional space, and every particle in the universe is simply the manifestation of a particular vibrational mode. Vanchurin's theory, by contrast, argues that the most fundamental object is not the string, but the neuron, and that the universe itself can be understood as a neural network. Neural networks are trainable mathematical structures inspired by the way the human brain works. Each individual neuron is a simple processing unit that can usually be described by a relatively simple mathematical function. A neural network is a graph of interconnected neurons whose behavior is governed by its weights, that is, by the strength of the connections between neurons. In essence, a neural network is like a programmable computer, except that the program is encoded in the weights rather than written as a sequence of instructions. According to Vanchurin, such a system could, in principle, reproduce behavior resembling both quantum mechanics and general relativity, the two fundamental pillars of modern physics. What makes this idea particularly fascinating is that it abandons the familiar metaphors. There are no superstrings, no infinite fields rippling like the surface of a lake, and no particles emerging as waves within those fields. There is only pure computation. The universe is a vast state machine that occupies a well-defined state at any given moment, then transitions to a new state according to a set of rules. In such a model, nonlocality is not surprising at all, because space itself is not fundamental. It simply emerges as a result of the underlying computation. Likewise, the mysterious collapse of the wave function becomes nothing more than a natural consequence of how the neural network operates. Now, let's imagine that we are members of an advanced alien civilization that has reached a level of technological development where simulating entire worlds has become possible. How would we go about creating such a simulated reality? At first glance, the idea of a neural network universe like the one proposed by Vanchurin seems promising. But there is one enormous obstacle: computational cost. A simulation like this would require an extraordinary amount of computing power. So the obvious question becomes, how could such a system be optimized? Before we can answer that, however, we first need to clarify the purpose of the simulation. If the goal is a perfect particle-by-particle simulation, then we have very little choice. We must simulate every single particle individually. But if the purpose of the simulated world is to serve conscious beings, then an entire arsenal of optimization techniques becomes available, allowing us to dramatically reduce the required computational power. If the purpose of the world is to serve conscious observers, then in reality, we only need to generate those parts of the universe that are directly accessible to them. This is exactly how every modern video game works. Think of a large MMORPG, such as World of Warcraft or Second Life. Although the game world is enormous, at any given moment, the computer renders only what is currently visible on the screen or through the VR headset. The rest of the world remains at rest on the servers and is loaded only when it becomes necessary. Of course, simulating reality requires more than just rendering visual images. Humans have 5 senses, so the simulation must also include sounds, smells, tactile sensations, and much more. But the underlying principle remains exactly the same. Just think about how tiny the portion of the universe is that we actually observe at any given moment, compared to the universe as a whole. This approach would allow for a radical optimization of computational resources, and it bears a striking resemblance to the observer-centered interpretations of quantum mechanics, according to which anything that is not being observed does not truly exist, or more precisely, does not possess well-defined properties. Of course, the situation is not quite that simple. Imagine that you are holding an apple in your hand and take a bite. The system simulates everything: the way the apple feels, the way it looks, and the way it tastes. The simulation is perfect. Then you place the apple on the table and close your eyes. At that moment, nobody is observing the apple. So in principle, there is no longer any need to continue simulating it. However, the system must still preserve the apple's state, including the exact location of the bite you took. If you were to open your eyes and see a fresh, untouched apple, or no apple at all, the simulation would be immediately exposed. Such a world would bear little resemblance to the reality we know. The system therefore has to retain the apple's state, even when nobody is observing it, which requires a significant amount of memory. But the problem goes even deeper than that. The world continues to evolve even when nobody is observing it. For example, the bitten part of the apple begins to turn brown due to oxidation. Simulating such processes in real time would require a tremendous amount of computing power. In the language of quantum mechanics, we could say that the system must simulate the complete wave function of the unobserved world, a wave function that describes the superposition of every particle in the universe. In practice, this would require an almost infinite amount of computational power. Fortunately, there is a loophole. The reason it would bother you if the apple disappeared or failed to turn brown is that it would violate your internal mental model of the world. When you open your eyes, you expect the apple to be exactly where you left it, with the bite mark exactly where you remember it. If that expectation is not met, you immediately realize that something is wrong with reality. But if the system has access to your mental model and generates the world in a way that remains consistent with it, you will never notice any contradiction. From your perspective, the simulation will appear perfect. This solution works perfectly when there is only a single observer in the system. But what happens if several people are in the same room, each with their own mental model? From a philosophical perspective, reality is often defined as that which all observers agree upon. In other words, reality is the state in which the mental models of all observers are in harmony. There are two fundamental ways to achieve that harmony. The first possibility is to assume that an objective reality exists, and that every observer perceives it in the same way. Since everyone receives information from the same external source, they naturally experience the outside world consistently. But there is another possibility. We could assume that some mechanism in the background continuously synchronizes the mental models of all observers, and that this synchronization creates the illusion of a shared, consistent, objective reality that exists independently of any observer. This second approach would once again save an enormous amount of computational power. There would no longer be any need for massive storage to preserve the complete state of the world, nor for the computational resources required to simulate unobserved processes. The system would only need to keep the observer's mental models in sync. Beyond these synchronized mental models, there is no need for an external, objective reality at all. Let's imagine a simple experiment. Someone enters a sealed room where an apple is sitting on a table. They take a bite, then leave the room. Afterward, their friend enters and sees the same bitten apple on the table. But this consistency does not arise because the apple exists as an objective physical object. Instead, it exists because the system has synchronized the mental model of the bitten apple from the first observer's mind into the second observer's. In such a simulation, the non-locality of quantum mechanics is not surprising at all. The physical distance between observers becomes completely irrelevant, because space itself is merely part of the simulation. The only thing that matters is the information acquired through observation, which, thanks to the synchronization mechanism, appears instantly in the mental models of every observer involved. In such a system, not only space, but time itself loses its fundamental status. If a present-day observation somehow contradicts an earlier one, the synchronization mechanism could simply modify the past. If everyone's memories of a particular event are updated, then the past itself has changed. And if this new version of the past creates further contradictions, the process can repeat until a completely consistent history emerges. Since observers would have no memory of the discarded timelines, they would perceive reality as if there had always been only a single, objective history. Who knows? Perhaps dragons, wizards, and fairies really did exist in the past of this world, only for a synchronization event to erase that version of history, leaving these creatures behind only in myths and fairy tales. A bizarre idea, isn't it? It certainly is, but not much more bizarre than the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, according to which everything that can happen, provided it does not violate the laws of physics, actually does happen somewhere. Compared to that, this version of the simulation hypothesis is far more economical. It doesn't require an infinite number of worlds, just a single one that is continuously rewritten. A fundamental property of such a simulation is that it would be indistinguishable from objective reality. If we were ever to discover a security flaw in the system, a bug that could serve as evidence that we are living inside a simulation, the system could simply go back in time by modifying the observer's memories and mental models, thereby erasing the problem. In other words, it would resynchronize everyone's mental model to a version of reality in which the bug had never existed in the first place. For that reason, we cannot rule out the possibility that our own universe is itself such a simulation. As I mentioned earlier, this model is no more radical or speculative than many of the existing interpretations of quantum mechanics. In fact, we could even call it the simulated reality interpretation of quantum mechanics. Perhaps reality is much more like an information processing system than a gigantic machine built from tiny particles. Perhaps space, time, matter, and even the strange phenomena of quantum mechanics are all manifestations of the same deeper computational process. If these questions fascinate you, and you'd like to explore how relativity, quantum mechanics, consciousness, artificial intelligence, and the simulation hypothesis might fit together into a single coherent worldview, then download my book, Simulated Reality, for free. You'll find the download link in the video description below. And if you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It may seem like a small gesture, but it helps these videos reach more people who are curious about science, physics, and the deeper nature of reality. And finally, one question. If you had to design a universe, how would you do it? Would you really simulate every particle individually? Or would you simply keep the mental models of conscious observers consistent? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I'm curious to hear which approach you find more plausible.